Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ESSA designation overview session. My name is Shirley Vargas. I am the administrator for the Office of Coordinated School and District Support, and I'm joined by my two colleagues, Derek and Dottie, and I'll have them introduce themselves.
Yeah. I'll think about it. I got to join this meeting, but
Derek, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Derek Dickinson, I'm the Director of Accountability and the Assistant Administrator in the Office of Coordinated School and District Support. So there's a good chance you've gotten an email from me. I apologize.
And I'm Dottie Hoisman. I'm not going to apologize for anything. It's good to see so many smiling faces on this nice Wednesday. I am the Assistant Administrator on the ESSA Federal Programs team. So happy to be here today.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen so y'all can follow me along. Dottie will put in the chat. It should be a view-only copy of the PowerPoint, but you feel free to make a copy if you want to make any notes on it. I want to have it for your own records. We'll also be sure that this will be posted on our AQuest webpage, where you can find the video of this presentation shortly, and hopefully by the end of this week, as soon as possible. So before we get started, want to start with a quick welcome inclusion activity. Just help us re-enter this space. And a quick question that we have for you all is, what was a highlight from your holiday break? And if you're still on break, thank you for taking the time to join us during your break. But you can have an opportunity to answer what's a holiday break, a highlight from your break, or something you're excited for in 2024. If you see my little images, I'm excited to hopefully read a little more for pleasure, maybe check off some to-dos or do some more travel, but whatever you'd like. Chat is open. Please feel free to type something in. We'll take 30 to 60 seconds to do this. Thank you. So I know as you come in, you might be unmuted. We may mute you from time to time, just to make sure that no one misses out on anything we might be discussing. But we'll make sure that if you do have a question at any point, that you have an opportunity to use the chat, or if there's an opportunity to ask it aloud, we'll definitely have you do that. Oh, grandson, granddaughter, love that. Family, love that a lot too. Wait, Olympic trials, awesome. Okay.
Shirley, did you see somebody's going to spend a day or night on a working sheep farm Airbnb? Now, we'll want a full report on that.
I would love that. Yes. Reading, okay. Byron, good luck finishing your UNK degree. Love that. So thank you so much. This is just a, quick little icebreaker, but also a way to welcoming you into this space. I know that it may, or most likely will feel like a lot of information coming to you at once. And we want to do our best to make sure we give you a lot of information, but also resources and tools you can come back to, as well as answer any questions. So as you might see here on the objectives, we reviewed a lot of the notes that you all shared in your registration form on Zoom, and a recurring theme was just wanting to get more information. For some, this might be the first time you're learning about a designation. For others, this might just be a quick refresher. So wherever you are, hopefully you can find your way into this space today, and keep an open mind as we go through this. We'll be sure to review the designations, the processes, what's required for each of these designations, and then ultimately share some resources at the end and allow for some time for questions and answers. Some of the things we also observed from the questions asked on the Zoom registration was that there may be some different expectations for what you might get from this session, and we're hoping this slide can help adjust those expectations for you. So what you'll see on the left-hand side is what we'll be covering, right? Requirements for these designations per federal law, looking at the data that was used, exit criteria, right? Always the question of, well, we got on, how do we get off? And then what are those other requirements? We will not be discussing AQuest classifications or the process that goes with that. we will not unfortunately be engaging in the future changes or iterations for this process for either the classifications or the designations. We will not be discussing priority schoolwork right now, nor will we be going into any school-specific data, but we'll have some faux data, if you will, like our friends from SEED like to say, where you will walk you through a process. You can understand the methodology that's used for identifying a school with a particular designation. So to get right in, we have laws that govern our accountability system, right? And it's important that we kind of just ground ourselves in that, because we have state law, so 79-760-06, which talks about what is required for our state classification system. And then we have our ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act law, that basically tells us what federal designations we have to do. In some states, these are one and the same and they make it happen. Here we actually operate two specific designation processes. So what is the actual difference between those two pieces? So you'll see on the left-hand side, there are excellent, great, good, need support to improve, and that's part of our classification system. And then on the right-hand side, you see our different designations, and they're situated in a triangle, more to mimic, if you will, the way we operate our NEMTSS process, and talk about what are the different types of support that are available to the different levels of designations. It's very possible that a school might be a great school and have a CSI, ATSI designation, or have a TSI designation, because these are two independent processes. So I know that was a question that we received a lot of, and also something that we saw in the Zoom registrations. We wanted to just make sure we double down on that here. Just as a quick reminder, we actually do have two types of designations. We have state and federal designations. You'll see that on the bottom of the triangle, TSI and ATSI, and in the middle, CSI actually come from the ESSA federal law, and our priority schools actually comes from our state statute. And while that's a state requirement, we have it here with the designations pyramid because that's our most intensive level of support. But today's focus will be on CSI, TSI, and ATSI. So to break down some numbers, what are we actually talking about? So I provided you the numbers for our priority schools, of which there are 3. We have 90 CSI schools this year. CSI by definition, and we'll have a few other slides that talk about these definitions more thoroughly forthcoming. But as a reminder, CSI is our lowest 5% of Title I schools. It's also any public high school, regardless of title status, that has a 4-year cohort graduation rate lower than 67%. And what is the newest designation this year? That this is also a CSI designation for a student group that does not exit within a specific state-determined amount of time. So this year is the first time ATSI schools from 2019 were eligible to exit. If they did not exit, the school becomes an CSI ATSI school. And you'll see the 90, that's the total number of schools, both for lowest 5%, low grad rate, as well as CSI ATSI. And then on the bottom, we have our TSI and ATSI schools. We have 257 schools this year that have been identified for at least one student group. Before I get further into the nuts and bolts of each of these designations, we want to actually review really quickly the order of operations here. We heard a lot of feedback and acknowledge that our timing can most definitely improve, and we will continue to strive to do that. This year specifically, we did submit an amendment to our ESSA plan, which basically dictates what we're going to do. And because of the pandemic and interruptions to data and processes, we knew that we couldn't just go back to what we were doing pre-pandemic, so we had to make those adjustments. In order to make that happen, we submit that amendment. We received initial approval on November 22nd, which was the date that we also released our state classifications. So we couldn't possibly release our federal designations at the same time, because we wanted to make sure that we were conscious of recalculating anything that may have been done in error during the draft period, which happened prior to that date. So I just wanted to offer that context, and you'll hear me describe more about this context for in a few slides. But the order of operations here is that we have a statutory requirement to complete the classifications before December 31st, and that's always the first thing that we do. We then move on to the federal designation period, where we start with identifying our lowest 5% of Title I schools, since that is the foundation for the subsequent designations. At that time, we're also reviewing any exit criteria. So any CSI schools that may have been previously identified, we then review, are they eligible to exit this year? Did they meet those requirements? If so, they can exit. If not, they continue. We then establish thresholds for TSI and ATSI. We then apply the exit criteria for those schools, and then we generate a list of all identified schools. We also, I'd be remiss if I don't say that I'm grateful for the team that we have at NDE, and this is also a very small team, so it's dependent on just a handful of people to engage in the state level work. So I appreciate it and continue to appreciate everyone's patience as we continue to strengthen this team, as well as strengthen the processes that we have here. So in the next subsequent slides, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the different designations here. So we have our 3 designations I've already described, specifically CSI, and I just want to underscore again the CSI ATSI designation here. And the other piece here is that it typically would happen every 3 years. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic and interruptions to our data and processes, we were awarded an addendum that allowed us to say, actually, you all can extend timelines and you all can do these flexibilities, but you have to make sure you identify CSI schools again in 2023, which is where we are right now. On the bottom, we have our student group focused areas, which is TSI and ATSI. TSI specifically compares the performance of student groups to the lowest quarter of Title I schools, and ATSI compares student groups to the lowest 5%, which is our CSI schools. In all of these cases, districts that have schools with these designations are eligible to be monitored by NDE staff. CSI specifically and CSI ATSI are monitored yearly by NDE staff, and those schedules and all those things are organized and coordinated with appropriate district and school staff ahead of time. So what exactly is CSI? I've already described it a few times, but what I want to just drill down here, and in the next slide, I'll drill down again, are the specific indicators that are used. So when we talk about CSI, these are public schools, that provide targeted or school-wide Title I services to students. And we use a filter-like process to then identify what those schools are. The specific indicators that we use, I'll drill down more deeply in the next slide here in a minute, but also want to reiterate the 4-year cohort graduation rate below 67%. That is regardless of title status. And this is where we see our CSI designations coming from. So as a quick reminder, you probably have seen this slide, and if you've been to NACIA, AAAC, or maybe admin days, we've attempted really to share this graphic a lot so people can understand who makes up the data, if you will, and what's taken into account in this data. So what you see with status, right, percent proficient, on track or higher, progress towards ELP, those are English learners that are taking the ALPA 21 assessment, and whether or not they're on track or making partial progress towards English proficiency. We have growth and non-proficiency. That's how students are performing not only on the assessment year to year, but how cohorts perform year over year. Graduation rate, 2 specific points here, 4-year and 7-year extended rate. And chronic absenteeism, this year is a reduction in chronic absenteeism like we have in prior years. And then science proficiency, percent of students who are proficient on the science assessment. How would a school get identified for CSI? So Specifically, for CSI, what we have here is a funnel-like system. It's also been affectionately referred to as Skittles, if you will. But the point is that we start with all the possible eligible schools, and then we go through a series of stages, slowly removing schools that exceed the specific threshold, ultimately arriving us to the identified schools here. I want to just reiterate here that during the draft and the preliminary period, so it was about maybe a week or so in November where we were able to, on NEP Secure, release the ESSA designations. We in fact made an error in that calculation, which is why when we received that approval, we were able to go back, redo all the recalculations and ensure that we were actually doing this appropriately. So let me tell you a little bit of what that means in the subsequent slide. But here I also want to drill down on the fact that for comprehensive support and improvement schools, we must, by federal law, identify the lowest 5% of Title I schools. And in order for that to be true, we have to separate stage 2. Initially, the intent was, based on a lot of stakeholder feedback, was that we wanted to make sure that we were identifying the lowest performing schools in our state. Specifically for Title I, lowest 5%, excuse me, I apologize for saying it like that. We were looking to identify the lowest 5% of Title I schools. So in order to do that, we have to take these two indicators separately. Therefore, we take the lowest quarter of stage 1 schools in growth and the lowest quarter of stage 1 schools in non-proficiency in order to ensure that we meet the lowest 5%. So what this means here, at the very beginning, we have to start first and foremost to say, what are all the Title I schools that we have? So stage 0 is actually outside, so it's not even accounted for here, as you can see. We have 452 Title I schools. However, the only schools that are eligible are those that actually have they're at least serving 10 students in that specific school in the grades there, and that they are over 2 years in operation. Like they're not brand new schools, less than 2 years. So this is where there was that error that occurred. So we wanted to make sure that we clarified and went through every single thing. And then here's where we ended up with 427 eligible schools. 5% of 427 is 22 schools. That means we need to get to the end of the filter and have at least 22 schools. So in order to do that, like I've already said in the previous slide, we have to separate stage 2. Only for CSI. You'll hear me in a moment talk about TSI and ATSI, and we did exactly what was intended to, which was do both together. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But just wanted to go through this process here. And this, along with the delay in our approval, is what led to the delay in us being able to publicly release this information to you all and to your school leaders. So what does this mean on AQuest reports? So when you go on the NEP Secure, you obviously are able to see your AQuest reports. Every public school receives a CSI summary, regardless of where you end up on that in that funnel. And this is more for informational purposes. So you'll see in the first one, it says furthest progress in CSI designation stage 1. Essentially what we do is just let you know you in fact were eligible and you only made it to stage 1. That's just for information. You have nothing to do. It doesn't mean you're a CSI. It's just to keep you informed, as we're required to do that for every school. And in the bottom, you'll see you probably receive none because you do not meet that criteria. So that is just there for information only. And we wanted to just share that with you today so you have an understanding of why it exists. For high school, it's a similar process, with the exception that the indicators are slightly different, obviously, and the order in which they occur are slightly different. For high school, we have status, academic progress, and progress towards ELP all in the first stage. The second stage is solely graduation, and the third stage is a combined score for math, for science, and chronic absenteeism, excuse me. So what are the requirements? What support do I get? How does the school exit? Again, this is just CSI. So there is a requirement here where all schools are required to complete a needs assessment. We have the NDE Comprehensive Needs Assessment offered by Hourglass. If you were able to join us yesterday on the CNA webinar, you were able to learn a little bit more about that process. If not, we'll also be sure to share our CNA recording and materials. It's going to be important that the CSI work is connected to other improvement work already happening in the school and the district. And also the ND will be providing CSI specific workshops to support schools and districts in improvement planning and sense making with all the data and requirements. What I want to focus on in this slide really quickly here is that CSI schools are eligible to receive federal funds in order to implement their improvement plans. And schools must select evidence-based practices and interventions that have been proven to be successful in order to be eligible to receive those funds. And this is really critical, one, because it comes from federal law, and it's also important that we're investing time and energy and resources into things that have proven to have worked, especially when working with students and student groups that need the most support to improve. So we wanted to just offer this as a quick little bullet point here of the types of support you receive, and one of those is financial. What does it mean to exit this status? So if you're CSI lowest 5%, you actually have 3 pieces that must be true in order to exit. You must not be re-identified, so go through that whole funnel, right? Not be re-identified, not be in the lowest 10%. Although to enter CSI, it's the lowest 5%, to exit, it's the lowest 10%. U.S. Department of Ed actually wants to make sure that we're not just setting the bar just slightly above where you may have been, but actually have shown some demonstrable growth to be able to say the likelihood of a school being re-identified in the next cycle is not so great because they've made that progress. And then the third piece is making significant progress across all indicators. So that slide where I showed all of the images there with the text for the indicators, all of them must improve in order for that CSI school to exit. And then those schools that are identified for the first time this year are actually eligible to exit in 3 years, as the law is intended for this to be a 3-year designation period. For low grad rate, there's a distinction here. That means this is a school that has a graduation rate lower than 67% for their 4-year cohort. This school must have improved graduation rates for 2 consecutive years, and the graduation rate must be above 67%. So it's really important because we want to make sure that a school is able to demonstrate growth in their graduation, but also that it's sustained for at least 2 years. So really quickly, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about timelines and cohorts. For the sake of this previous section, right here, I want to just draw your attention to CSI specifically. On the top right here, this was the initial designations for the very first cohort in 2018. These schools were eligible exit last year. We also had new schools identified last year. These schools are eligible to exit every year till 2026. And this was part of that addendum I said we had submitted a couple of years ago. And then schools identified this year are eligible to exit in 2026. So it's a 3-year designation. The distinction is for high schools with graduation, low graduation rates are eligible to exit every year. But you have to show 2 consecutive years of improved graduation rate. The last thing I want to just quickly touch on for CSI, because this is our second to last most intensive level of support, is something called more rigorous options. ESSA law requires our state plan to have something in place for a school that does not exit after a determined amount of time. And what that means here is that a CSI school that does not exit has a couple of options. They can, and it follows or mirrors our priority school statute as well, where they can significantly revise their plan, create a brand new plan, or engage in an alternative administrative structure at the local level, not determined by the NDE. All not exited schools actually will be required to complete some additional steps. So they'll be required to complete a needs assessment. They'll be required to engage in an external review of instructional practices, grade appropriate assignments, as well as tasks that students are doing. And this is all, and they're all receiving technical assistance to continued improvement planning, and will be monitored by a cross-functional team at the NDE. So for TSI and ATSI, which is student group specific, I want to quickly talk about what the student groups are. The U.S. Department of Ed outlines the minimum 10 student groups, which is the student groups that we focus on here at in our state. We have 7 racial and ethnic groups. We have economically disadvantaged students, English learners, and students with disabilities. So we review every student group for these 10 students for every school. So when we're talking about our designation process, we're actually looking at tens of thousands of pieces of data to ensure that we're going through this process and identifying the appropriate student groups. But what's actually required? What are you supposed to do when you have this designation? TSI and ATSI are district-led improvement efforts. That means we notify the district, your superintendent and your DAC, and anyone else who needs to be appropriately identified, and they support the identified school with drafting a plan, implementing that plan, communicating to the school that they have a designation and what that means. I want to clarify, because we get this question a lot. Well, what plan do I need to submit? Is this a brand new thing? So you are not required, if you have a TSI or ATSI school, you are not required to submit a brand new plan. We want to make sure you are leveraging something that's already in action, such as a continuous improvement plan. If you have an MTSS plan that's separate, then that's fine. But if it's together, that should be the plan. Let's say, for example, you've been identified for students with disabilities. You may want to leverage your targeted improvement plan to better focus and align those student groups there. Maybe your Title I specific plan, your consolidated plan that you submit for your ESSA, whatever the case might be, we want to allow for a lot of that flexibility. However, there are requirements that must be met for this designation. Every plan must be developed in partnership with multiple stakeholders in your school community. It must be informed by all accountability indicators. So that graph, slide that I shared that had all the indicators, all those indicators must be taken into account when drafting these plans. And then specifically for ATSI, though whatever plan you choose to leverage must include a resource allocation review. And we have some links to share with you towards the end that you can review and determine how to best approach that at your local district. So again, not required to create a brand new plan. You're not required to submit it to the NDE. You are required to have a plan and have it be informed by these indicators, have it be in partnership with multiple stakeholders, and for ATSI specifically, must engage in a resource allocation review. And you must have evidence of all of this for when you're monitored and you're asked for it, you have it, but we're not collecting that data. So how do we actually get to the part where you're like, I've been identified? So we're going to take you really quickly through the methodology and the process for how we engage in identifying TSI and ATSI. The following example is focused on TSI, but the same process, just the numbers are different for ATSI. As a reminder, TSI is comparing a student group for the lowest quarter of Title I schools. And these are the AQUES indicators that are used. So the first thing that we do is we start with a set of questions and when we go through the filter. So specifically for this process right here, we have all public schools, and you see the asterisk, all public schools with at least 10 students in each of the following student groups. We also know that some students are in multiple student groups, right? So we just want to make sure that we iterate that. It's possible that a Hispanic student might be in the Hispanic student group and might also show up in economic disadvantaged student group, or might also show up in the English learner or student with disability student group. Just wanted to clear that up right here. Does the school serve at least 10 students in any given student group? If the answer is yes, we're moving into the next stage. But first, I want to show you this example, right? Nebraska Middle School has 400 students. I just wanted to quickly show you this information here. This is how we go through this process, right? We have students here. However, there's only a few student groups that actually meet this N size. So what you see here, here's the school name, the student group, the N size. Those that are highlighted in yellow move to the next stage. Those that are in gray, say exclude, are not included in this designation process. So then once we determine these are the student groups that are eligible to continue to stage 1, the question we have to ask is, well, are students proficient and or are students making progress towards English language proficiency? So then what we see here for this example is that in stage 1, we're comparing each eligible student group, their status score to the status score of the comparison group. And then we're also comparing the student group in the ELPA 21 assessment and then seeing who is moving forward or who's excluded. From reviewing this data, you see here that actually the EL student group, economic disadvantaged student group, Hispanic student group, and student with disability student groups will continue to the next stage because they did not meet the threshold here. These numbers all come from the ESSA designation business rules. So after we go through that phase, we're asking ourselves, well, are they making progress? Are they growing towards proficiency? So then the question that we have to ask here, and here is the distinction. I spent some time in the beginning of this presentation talking about how in CSI, we did them separately. For TSI and ATSI, both indicators must be low before we move forward. So we want to make sure we're actually identifying student groups that actually did not meet the threshold for every indicator. I just want to make that really abundantly clear because it's really important that we understand that distinction between the two designations. So what you see here is that actually the EL student group and the economic disadvantaged student group did not, right? They exceeded the threshold. So they in fact are excluded from moving to the next stage. However, the Hispanic student group and students with disability student groups are low in both indicators, so they move on to the next stage. And then the last stage is actually looking at, well, are they coming to school? Are they reducing their chronic absenteeism? And are they proficient in science? And here we take those two indicators separately. And what we see here is, in fact, in reviewing the data, the two student groups that were flagged for TSI are actually the Hispanic student group and students with disabilities because they did not exceed the threshold for chronic absenteeism reduction and proficiency in science. And that's how we end up to the schools that are identified for a particular designation. We go through this for every eligible student group, for every public school in our state. Ultimately, that's what I already said. ATSI, similar process with the exception that this is comparing then to the lowest 5% of Title I schools, which is our CSI schools. A little caveat here, and I'll go to the next slide to say that, is that per the US Department of Education, we're actually looking at the highest, lowest 5% of Title I schools. So it might seem a little different when you're looking at the numbers and you're saying, how is it that our CSI schools, have a particular benchmark. It's actually because we cannot take the lowest of the low per the U.S. Department of Ed. They're saying this is the lowest 5% of Title I groups. So it's actually the highest of the lowest 5%. And if that's a little confusing, I apologize. I'll do my best to better explain that in the future. But I wanted to say that now because that is something that continues to come up, and it's something that we're working towards getting better at describing, and ultimately getting better at truly identifying our schools here. So for ATSI, you saw the comparison group for both elementary, middle, and high school is our lowest 5% of Title I schools. And I just wanted to show that there for comparison's sake. So what are the differences between both of these designations? What we have here is that TSI happens every year, and a school can enter and exit TSI every year with no problem. There's no additional requirements, if you will, beyond ensuring that there's a plan in place and that it's been informed by all indicators and by stakeholders in the local community, while ATSI typically happens every 3 years when CSI happens, because the comparison groups, right, are one another, are the lowest 5%. TSI designation should be taken as a signal, almost like an early warning system, if you will, that a student group needs some attention. ATSI is a much urgent designation. And it's also urgent because you have 3 years for that student group to exit that status. If not, that school becomes a CSI school. Put another way, if that student group in and of themselves was a school, they would be identified as among the lowest 5% of Title I schools in our state. That is really important and should be a flag for a call to action. ATSI schools that don't exit, right, like I said, automatically become a CSI school. And then the last piece here is that any improvement plan used by an ATSI school is required to engage in a resource allocation review. And I can't stress that enough, mostly because it is important to understand if the point I just made is that they're compared to the lowest 5% of Title I schools, then what the U.S. Department of Ed is stating in their law is essentially saying, well, what can we do about the resources that we offer to ensure that that student group is improving their academic performance? So then how does my school exit? What happens if I don't exit in the specified timeline? So specifically here, as a reminder, TSI is annually, so that way you don't even see TSI on this graphic, right? You do see CSI and ATSI because of the nature of ATSI moving up to CSI if they do not exit. We also want to show the overlapping nature of what has happened in the past couple of years, especially since we just identified some schools last year. We identified them this year. We will not be identifying any new schools aside from TSI until 2026. So I want to make that real distinction really clear here. You'll see 23, 24 right here. And then 26, 27 is the next time we'll identify a new cohort of schools. What does it mean to exit this designation? So for ATSI specifically, not be re-identified, and made sufficient growth in stage 1, which is status and or progress towards English language proficiency. Sufficient growth here literally means any positive growth from the baseline year or the initial year of identification. So for example, if you were identified in 2019, we compared how your students did last year to the way students performed in 2019. Right, so those are the 2 points that we're comparing. If you were identified last year for the first time, 2022, we're comparing how students did in 21-22 compared to last year. So this is what when we say initial year of identification or baseline year, it's when you were first identified. We have obviously links, and we'll continue to show more resources in a moment here. One last thing I just want to quickly iterate on the second point of stage 1. It is possible, like you saw in the earlier example, that students are taking the NSCAS, ELA, and math, and might also be taking the ALPA 21 assessment. And we saw this year that in fact, some students increased their proficiency scores, but didn't in fact increase their progress toward DLP. So it's important to take note of those two indicators in stage one, and if they're appropriate, if they're like identified in your designation. So that's something we can work with individual schools on offline, should you want that. So how did my school get identified? Before I move on to this next segment, because this is the main one that I know I want to spend some time on too, which is identified for CSI, ATSI. I wanted to just stop right here and see if there was anything from my colleagues or anything that we needed to highlight. I'm seeing some, no, okay. It's a lot of information, I understand. So thank you for sticking with me and our team on this. So this is the newest designation that we have this year. It's CSI, ATSI. This means there's a student group from 2019 that did not exit this year, and therefore the school has become a CSI school. We want to clarify what that means, what are the requirements, what's the exit criteria. So you'll see on the right-hand side on your AQuest report, you probably have seen furthest progress in CSI designation. This says automatically because of a student group not exiting in from ATSI. This specifically means that either the student group was identified for ATSI again, and or the student group did not make sufficient growth in stage one as compared to the initial baseline year of identification. So that means the student group did not show any positive growth in status and or progress towards ELP if applicable. So we say that because it's important to understand that these two indicators are identical in weight. The US Department of Ed has stated that these two indicators must match their importance, which is why they're the first two things that happen in that stage in the process for identifying schools. What are the requirements here? Requirements are that the schools must conduct a comprehensive needs assessment. There's some flexibility in that, but we will be sure to communicate once we send all this information back out to everyone. But completing the CNA here means that you can take a screener, you can manually select tenants, or you can elect to do the entire CNA, but more information is shared on our CNA webinar, which we'll share with everyone. Submit an improvement plan means literally just to have, you need to have an improvement plan and you will be eligible to receive federal funds. You would be submitting that plan through our GMS portal, which is where we grant the federal funds from. But more information is forthcoming with that. So you do not have to take any specific action at this specific moment right now, but you will be required to have some type of plan, whether that's your continuous improvement plan, whether that's your NEMT assessment, whatever the case might be. But the point is to ensure that you have an improvement plan at your district. The NE does not prescribe any specific improvement plan that a school must follow. For exit criteria, I just want to reiterate this because this is really important. You may have been identified as CSI, ATSI this year, but you are actually eligible to exit at any point until 2026. What this means, though, in order to exit, you must not be re-identified for ATSI for the same student group, right? The second piece is that you must make sufficient progress, in status and or progress towards ELP, which means that first stage, like I just described, and again, sufficient growth literally means positive progress made from the actual year that we are reviewing as compared to the initial year that the school was identified. So again, for the schools that just received this designation, you are then being compared to 2019, right? So if you want to receive more information, more clarification, we can definitely get more school specific on individual calls offline, but just wanted to share that with you. This is actually comparing how that student group did in 2019 to then how that student group did this past year, and ultimately how they would be doing this year, 23-24, when we engage in accountability in the fall. It's also possible that your school might have multiple designations. We do in fact have buildings that have an ATSI designation and a CSI designation, or a CSI designation and a CSI ATSI designation, right? There's a lot of alphabet soup and all that. What's important, right, is to ensure that that you are clear on what the requirements are for each of these different designations. So for example, like I said, you can be CSI lowest 5% and have become a CSI ATSI because of a particular student group. And ultimately, what this means is that all designations have a set of requirements and timelines to track. So it's important that you're also tracking the data for each of those, so you know which data you're actually being held to. In this particular example, CSI lowest 5% 2023 means that the school was identified as one of the lowest 5% of Title I schools. That means the overall performance of that school this past year on how students tested 22-23. CSI ATSI student group English learners, that means that that school was identified because of the how EL students performed in 2019 did not show improvement in 22-23. So we're just comparing the status in ELP for English learners from 2019 and 2023, not throughout, just those 2 points. So these two designations have different requirements, different timelines. You can exit CSI ATSI next year, but you remain CSI until 2026. So it's just, we try really hard to provide as many examples, as this is really contextual and can change, and it's obviously different for every school. So we have a set of so many resources available to you all. And if there's something that you're like, Shirley, actually, this would be beneficial, or remove this is not helpful, we are more than willing and always accept to listen and take feedback so that we can be as responsive as possible. But these are some tools and resources that we have created as a result of feedback from multiple stakeholders throughout the last couple of years. The first is a FAQ document and a customizable slide deck. So a slide deck, just like the one I'm using right now, is available to everyone so that you can access this time over time and come back to it and ask us any questions. An FAQ document, if you're wondering, well, how do I talk about this? How do I, put this in context with other things? A resource allocation guidance document is also available to you. We do not prescribe any particular process you should do, but we offer a lot of guidance around how it might look, feel, and sound like to do a resource allocation in your local school community. And then lastly, a planning district level guidance for plan identification for TSI and ATSI schools. This document came as a result of school leaders asking for something when there was a lot of different transition periods between either district level leaders leaving or school level leaders leading, and not sure what happens when there's personnel changes. So this document helps to capture, actually, this is the plan we are using. Here's the people that were involved. It's just almost a small graphic organizer that's meant to capture everything and help then communicate to anyone else that might be transitioning or anyone else who might need support to ensure that there's consistency for that identification. And then lastly, we just have additional resources on our aquest.com resources page, where we have our business rules, our one-pagers, we have the FAQ documents, and this is also the place where you will be able to find this recording as well as the CNA recording and the appropriate PowerPoints and any other materials. So it is 3:49. I'm gonna have this time available to us to ask any specific questions. I'll stop sharing my screen here in a moment. We do have a feedback survey that we would love to just get your honest thoughts about what helped, what didn't help, what could be helpful, so that we can continuously improve in our delivery of support and resources. Is there anyone in particular that has a burning question or any thought that they'd like to share with us?
There is a question in the chat from Mandy.
Yes. Yes, there are 90 schools. That does in fact include CSI, ATSI schools. And there are 42 CSI schools specifically. That means the remainder are CSI, ATSI, of course. 150 schools out of 427 have a classification of some sort. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more, Darren?
I think there's more than 452, Shirley. Is that accurate?
Well, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah,
Yes,
we
I
can
can hear
now,
you,
Darren.
I didn't really plan on talking, so excuse me. On your one slide here, I see you got 90 CSI schools. I see you have 3 schools that are CSI or priority schools, right? And then you have 257 that are TSI or ATSI.
Yes.
So if I add those together,
Oh, yeah, no.
I think I'm at 350, and you said there was 427 eligible schools. Is that correct?
So we don't want to combine those, like some overlap actually, but I saw Derek
Okay.
was going to come out, so maybe I'll let him take this one.
Yeah, so the 427, Darren, is the number of Title I eligible schools in the elementary. So there are roughly 1,100 schools in the state, just over, I think. And so when you look at it that way, the 350 that, like Shirley said, is does include some overlap with different student groups showing up in the same school. And the 427 is just a fraction of the number of elementary schools we have.
Thank you.
I see Brian's question here. If a school in one district would move from CSI to ATSI, CSI after year 3 with the whole district, then move. Okay. So there's no district designations. These are all school-based, but it actually goes the other way. So you would go ATSI to CSI, ATSI, but not the other way. Oh, let me clarify. You could be CSI and CSI, ATSI because you have a student group that may have been flagged for that designation. So, but yes, but there's no district designation, so it wouldn't be all of a sudden a whole district.
And surely for that to happen, to go from CSI to CSI or CSI ATSI, you would have had to exit CSI and then had that student group not exit in the 3-year time frame. So it would be that would be a very dynamic situation.
When you receive access to the Hourglass platform, yes, Jamie. If you send an email to the Hourglass team, it's support, and I'll write it in the email here, support@hourglassets.com. They will send you a registration link. It's active for 24 hours. So if you don't activate it right away, you'll have to resend them another link. And then I saw Violet's question, and
Yeah, I would actually ask Violet, what specific resources are you having trouble finding on there?
So hi guys. I was looking, you had 3 different things posted
oh
on,
yeah,
and I was looking for all 3 of them. I couldn't-
love it. The images actually have a link to them. So if you click the image, it'll take you directly to the page.
Okay,
With the exception of the slide deck, because you can only get the slide deck from the FAQ. So you have to go to the FAQ,
perfect.
and that's on the page Derek just, yeah. But I'll put the page where you can find the other 2 resources as well. Any other questions anyone might have? Okay, perfect. As you go through all this and you're like, Shirley, Derek, Dottie, none of this works. Give me something else. Please please provide us as explicit as a possible solution as you can, so that we can be as responsive as possible. Thank you, Darren, of course. We are all available. Send us emails specifically for CSI and CSI, ATSI. We will be, depending on your region and your size, we may be doing some more individualized approaches than we have in the past, where we've done some more regional work. So both may be true, but if you're like, Shirley, I have a date, I have a time, I need you now, like we can try to make anything and everything possible. Just please let us know. Okay, well, it's 3:56. I'm gonna stop recording. And if you're hoping that I stop so you can ask a question, then by all means. But thank you for joining, and we'll be sure to update the aquest.com/resources page with what you need. Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.